Just a few hours from India's capital, archaeologists were digging at what they thought was a simple Indus Valley site. Nothing special, nothing unusual, until they brushed away the dust and found a fire altar, a Havan Kund, 7,500 years old. Older than the pyramids, older than Sumer. But here's the problem. According to mainstream history, Vedic fire rituals began thousands of years after the Indus Valley. So what is a Vedic-style fire altar doing in a site that is older than the Indus Valley itself? If this was just one site, you could call it a coincidence. But the same fire altars appear again and again across India. And Bhirrana is the oldest of them. So now we have to ask a very uncomfortable question. Did Indus Valley have an older ancestor, a forgotten civilization whose memory survives only in rituals and still that we perform today? The first few days at Bhirrana gave archaeologists nothing unusual. They uncovered domestic fire pits, small, shallow hearths where early families cooked their food, and industrial furnaces, deep chambers for heating copper and firing pottery. Everything looked ordinary until it didn't. Right in the middle of no homes, no workshop, no living area, they found a very different kind of fire installation. These pits were huge, 2 to 2.5 meters wide, nearly 1 meter deep, and built with thick, compact, burnt clay walls that showed deliberate shaping. And inside them, there was nothing industrial. Instead, archaeologists found charred bovine bones, horns cut clean at the base, grains placed deliberately with the remains, and layered ash, proving the fire was used in controlled rituals, repeatedly over time. So this wasn't cooking, this wasn't metalwork, this was ritualistic, possibly the oldest sacrificial fire ritual ever discovered in the subcontinent. Does it match the description of the Vedic Yajna? Well, surprisingly yes, very closely. Vedic altars described in Rigveda and Yajurveda are circular, square, or semicircular, and the Bhirrana ritual pit is circular, proportionate, and meticulously constructed, far beyond the need of domestic life. And here is what most people miss. If a community knows how to construct a temperature-controlled ritual pit altar, then building furnace for pottery, cooking, or metalwork becomes very obvious. Because the technology behind a yajna altar is fire control, the ability to generate stable heat, maintain it, and prevent it from burning out of control. This is not a simple skill of 7,500 BC. To melt copper without burning yourself, to cook food without destroying the clay oven, and to perform rituals without suffocating the participants. This required precise understanding of fire, airflow, heat, and structure. And the people of Bhirrana clearly mastered it. So if this pit is not Vedic enough for someone, well, that's fine. Leave that debate aside. Because here's something far bigger. Only a tiny fraction of Bhirrana has been excavated. Just a few trenches, a few rooms, handful of pits. The majority of the site, thousands of square meters, is still underground. And then comes the second shock. Bhirrana sits directly beside the paleo channel of a massive ancient river. Well, this is not speculation. This is hard geology. ISRO 1996 to 2000 LISS-3 images, ASI Paleo Channel Trenching, Satellite Hydrology by Yashpal, Sunil Gupta and KS Waldier, remote sensing by multiple teams over 2 decades, all map the same thing. A huge, extant river. The Gagra Hakar flowed right past Bhirrana during the exact period these ritual pits were active. Well, geologists call it Gagra Hakar, but Vedic scholars call it Saraswati. We are not merging the two. We are just asking the obvious question. Who were these people living 7,500 years ago, performing rituals, fire ceremonies on the bank of one of the largest rivers of ancient India? And why does this site, in shape, in location, in ritual behavior, matches the Rigvedic description so closely? Thousands of years before the period textbooks assigned to Vedas. And now comes the uncomfortable truth. Excavation at Bhirrana have stopped completely. And this is not one-off. Look around the world. Göbekli Tepe, only 5% excavated. Rakhigarhi, only 5% excavated. Sinoli, excavations halted after discoveries challenging AIT. And now, Bhirrana, the oldest dated site in the entire Saraswati civilization, untouched since 2006. So the real question is no longer what lies beneath this mound. It is what else did we already find here that forces us to rethink the story of ancient civilizations. Well, let's go there. Archaeologists thought that the 7500 BC fire altar was the headline. But the real shock began after the layers below them were cleared, because suddenly an ordinary excavation turned into a timeline breaker. The earliest deposits of Bhirrana, the ones older than 7000 BC, began yielding objects that had no business existing at this age. The first were the beads, not crude stones, not basic ornaments, but etched Carlinian beads, identical to the craftsmanship seen in mature Sindhu-Saraswati cities like Harappa and Dholavira, except these were 3000 years older. And then came turquoise and lapis, minerals that belonged to Afghanistan and Iran. And then came marine shell bangles in a settlement nowhere close to the sea. And suddenly the question was no longer what did we find at Bhirrana. It became how big was the world of these people? What other sites were existing that Bhirrana was trading with? Because someone in 7500 BC was moving stones and minerals across thousands of kilometers. And the style of these beads is the same fingerprint the civilization carries all the way into 2000 BC, a skill developed 5000 years ago. This single point breaks the traditional story that Sindhu-Saraswati civilization didn't appear in 2600 BC. Its craft traditions were evolving here, millennia earlier. But then came the next blow. Inside the same early levels, archaeologists found worked copper. Copper in India is supposed to appear around 4500 BC. But Bhirrana quietly pushes that clock back by almost 2000 years. No external influence, no evidence of metallurgy diffusing from the west, just a quiet settlement, mastering copper long before anyone wrote that in this timeline. And then the houses added a final layer of strangeness. These were not temporary huts. They show planning, mud brick walls, post holes for wooden frames, storage pits, drainage arrangements, even early granary-like features. It looks less like a village and more like the first draft of the city planning mindset that later built Kalibangan, Rakhigarhi, Lothal, and Harappa. So now the archaeologists were forced to ask a question textbooks never prepared them for. If this is what they built 7500 BC, what were they building before that? Because nothing at Bhirrana looks like first attempt. Everything looks like memory. Skills already learned, perfected, and practiced. And just when they thought they had reached the limit of the site's complexity, they found something far stranger, buried deep in the mound, object that does not match this age at all. The pattern in Bhirrana was falling into places. Yes, they had trade, city-like planning, drainage, copper storage, all the things that usually show up thousands of years later. Archaeologists genuinely thought the fire altars were going to be the big headlines of the city. Because once the dating came back to 7500 BC, even that single discovery was already enough to challenge the entire Sindhu-Saraswati timeline. But what came next? Well, they were not prepared for it. Because at the bottommost layer, the oldest layer ever touched at Bhirrana, they found something that didn't look important at all. An ordinary broken pot. Just a pot shred. But when they turned it around, the entire team froze. On this tiny fragment was a hand-drawn figure. A woman standing with one hip pushed out, one leg relaxed, both arms bent in that unmistakable stance. It was the dancing girl, not the bronze statue from Mohenjo-daro, not the polished figuring from the mature face. It was raw, minimal, hand-scratched version from thousands of years earlier. You can imagine that moment because if this potsherd was sitting in the earliest cultural layer, that means the artistic idea behind the dancing girl, the posture, the attitude, the silhouette existed at Bhirrana long before Mohenjo-daro ever rose. And suddenly the story changes. Because this isn't some village art. This is a civilization memory. This was a symbol that was traveling across 4,000 years, across 1,000 kilometers, across every rise and collapse of the Sindhu-Saraswati civilization. And let me just explain you. So think about this for a second. The memory of Jesus is 2,000 years old. The memory of the last Shivlingam of the Indus cities is 4,000 years old. But the memory of this girl in this exact pose survived more than 4,000 years from 7,500 BC to all the way up to 1900 BC. So the question is simple. Why her? And why this exact same pose? Why did the earliest people of Bhirrana living on the bank of an ancient Saraswati chose to preserve this so deliberately that even the civilizational spread, expanded, matured, and finally collapsed? This motif stayed alive. This is not an accident or a coincidence. This is an inherited idea, a signature carried through time. Maybe they were worshipping her. Why was she so important to them? And if one memory could survive 4 millennia, what else survived from these people? What else is buried in the remaining 90% of this site? And this is where Bhirrana forces us to pause. Because we are no longer looking at another ancient settlement. We are looking at a site that had already broken all the rules that we were taught in school, that the historians are taught in their universities. And it could break many more if the remaining soil is ever opened. And that brings me to something I want to say directly. Maybe these questions will remain unanswered, not because that there are no answers, but because the answers are still buried. Until someone deliberately decides to excavate the remaining site, until the 90% that is still untouched is finally opened, we are only looking at a prologue, a tiny window into a chapter of human history that was never supposed to be forgotten. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Sites like this, Bhirrana and Sinoli, they don't get shut down because archaeologists lose interest. They get shut down because the discoveries don't fit the template. They don't fit the safe timeline. They don't fit the colonial narrative of civilization came later. Something is stopping the big archaeology from continuing the search from truth. You can disagree with my views that this city aligns with the Vedic timeline. You can say it is a coincidence or just my interpretation. But the proofs are too many to ignore. And this is exactly why I made this video. Because Bhirrana, the oldest city we found so far, is where my search stopped for now. I promised you earlier that I want to attempt something that nobody has done properly, to define the correct archaeological based timeline of Vedas and see honestly and clearly whether they come before the so-called Indus Valley civilization or not. Not philosophy, linguistics, or speculations, just archaeology. And if you want me to make that video a collective breakdown of every excavation, every trench, every anomaly from Haryana to Cholistan, and compare it directly with the descriptions in the Rigveda, tell me below. And before you leave, sit with these questions for a moment and ask yourself, what else lies buried under our soil? This is Harry signing off. Stay curious.